The first thing I heard was the frantic pounding on my office door. Ryan, open this door right now. I glanced at the security monitor. 6 members of the Cedar Ridge Shores HOA board stood outside my office, dressed in expensive golf shirts and designer sunglasses, their calm, suburban confidence replaced by outright panic. Behind them, a line of luxury SUVs filled the parking lot, and dozens of homeowners were gathering, pointing toward the lake. I didn't move. Instead, I reached for my coffee and watched them through the camera. Another violent knock rattled the glass. "You can't do this," HOA President Linda Holloway shouted. "People are trapped. We have families waiting at the lake." I pressed the intercom button. "I believe that's exactly what your attorney told me yesterday," I replied evenly. "Something about not being responsible for other people's problems." Silence. Even through the speaker I could hear someone mutter, "Oh God." Linda stepped closer to the camera, her face flushed bright red. "Ryan, this isn't funny. Open the gates." I leaned back in my chair. "Funny? I didn't think your board found anything funny when you voted against paying my $50,000 emergency repair invoice after I saved every one of those lake houses from flooding. You were overcharging us. I submitted 3 engineering reports. You never had authorization. You begged me to stop the dam from failing." Her lips tightened. Around her, the other board members avoided eye contact. The truth was finally sinking in. The electronic gates protecting the private road around Cedar Ridge Lake weren't owned by the HOA. Neither were the access bridges nor the utility easements. Every keycard, every security code, every maintenance contract, every emergency access system, my company legally controlled all of it under agreements signed decades before most of these homeowners had ever moved into the neighborhood. And according to those same contracts, any unpaid maintenance invoice automatically suspended access privileges until the outstanding balance was satisfied. Exactly the clause their own attorney had insisted was perfectly enforceable during contract renewals. Now they were discovering what that actually meant. A sheriff's deputy pulled into the parking lot just as another dozen furious homeowners arrived. People were yelling. Someone was recording everything on their phone. Linda marched straight toward the deputy. "This man is illegally imprisoning hundreds of residents." The deputy looked at me through the office window before turning toward her. Then he asked one simple question. "Ma'am, does he own the access infrastructure?" Nobody on the HOA board answered, because they couldn't. The deputy slowly removed a folder from his patrol vehicle, opened it and frowned as he read the county records. Then he looked back at Linda. His expression changed completely. And that's when I realized the nightmare that had started 48 hours earlier was about to become something none of us would ever forget. "My name is Ryan Carter. I'm 42 years old and I own Carter Infrastructure Services, a small civil engineering and maintenance company based just outside Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Most people assume I spend my days sitting behind a desk drawing blueprints. The truth is, I'd rather be wearing steel-toe boots, walking a dam, inspecting a bridge, or checking drainage systems before sunrise. My father taught me that infrastructure isn't glamorous, but it's what keeps communities alive. Nobody notices a bridge until it fails, he'd tell me while tightening bolts on old county floodgates. Our job is making sure nobody ever has to." He built the company with 1 pickup truck and 2 employees nearly 40 years ago. When he passed away, he left me more than a business. He left me his reputation. The Cedar Ridge Lake development had been one of his proudest projects. Long before the luxury homes, private docks, and million-dollar lakefront properties existed, my father had helped construct the lake's retaining dam, emergency spillway, access bridge, and electronic security gate system. During negotiations with the original developer, he insisted on one condition. Our company, not the future HOA, would retain ownership and maintenance rights over the critical infrastructure. The developer agreed without hesitation. At the time, nobody imagined that decision would matter decades later. For years, the relationship was simple. The HOA paid its annual maintenance invoices. My crew inspected the dam every spring and fall, serviced the gates, maintained the bridge sensors, and tested the emergency drainage systems before every rainy season. No drama, no lawsuits, no arguments. The homeowners barely knew my name, and honestly, that was exactly how I liked it. Everything changed when Linda Holloway became HOA president. I first met her during an annual inspection meeting. She walked into the clubhouse 20 minutes late, wearing a tailored white blazer and carrying a leather portfolio like she was preparing for a corporate takeover instead of a neighborhood maintenance review. Without introducing herself, she flipped through my report. "These costs seem excessive." I smiled politely. "They're actually about 4% lower than last year's." She looked up. "That doesn't answer my question. It answers the one you're really asking." The room became noticeably quiet. Several long-time board members shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. One elderly man, Harold Simmons, cleared his throat. "Ryan's company has handled this property for decades. They've always been fair." Linda gave him a brief smile that never reached her eyes. "I'm sure they have." Then she closed the report. "But things are going to be different now." At first I dismissed the comment as the confidence of a new HOA president trying to make an impression. I should have known better. Over the following weeks, emails that had once taken hours to approve suddenly sat unanswered for days. Routine maintenance requests were questioned. Every invoice was scrutinized line by line. Linda demanded copies of decades-old contracts, engineering certifications, and ownership documents that no previous board had ever challenged. It wasn't just thoroughness. It felt like she was looking for something. I didn't know what, but I had the unmistakable feeling that someone wasn't trying to understand our agreement anymore. They were trying to find a way out of it. By early April, it was obvious Linda Holloway wasn't just asking questions anymore. She was building a case. Every email from the HOA had a different tone than before, formal, cold, and clearly reviewed by someone with legal experience. Instead of discussing maintenance schedules, they challenged contract language. Instead of approving inspections, they delayed them. One Tuesday morning, my office manager, Emily Ross, walked into my office holding a certified letter. "You've got another one," she said, placing it on my desk. "Third this month." I sighed before opening it. The letter accused Carter Infrastructure Services of inflating maintenance expenses, performing unauthorized work, and failing to provide sufficient documentation to justify recurring costs. I couldn't help but laugh. Emily frowned. "That's not exactly a funny letter. It is when they're accusing us of doing the same work they've approved and paid for every year since before Linda even lived here." Still, something about it bothered me. Not because the accusations had merit, they didn't. Because they were creating a paper trail. Someone wanted a dispute on record. A week later, I got the call that changed everything. It was just after 6 a.m. My phone rang before sunrise. "Ryan," my foreman, Mike Alvarez, said without even saying hello. "You need to get to Cedar Ridge right now." His voice was tense. "What's wrong?" "The north spillway retaining wall shifted overnight. I was already grabbing my truck keys. How bad?" "If we get another heavy storm before it's reinforced." He paused. Those lake houses are in serious trouble." 40 minutes later, I stood on top of the earthen dam with Mike and our lead engineer. A deep crack stretched across the concrete retaining section. Water was forcing its way through under enormous pressure. Mike pointed toward the widening fracture. "That wasn't here yesterday." I stared silently for several seconds. If the wall failed, the sudden release of water wouldn't destroy the entire neighborhood, but the lake level could surge hard enough to undermine foundations, flood docks, and cause millions of dollars in structural damage to the lakefront homes. There wasn't time for bureaucracy. I called Linda immediately. She answered on the fourth ring. "This better be important." "It is," I said firmly. "The north retaining wall is failing. We need emergency authorization to begin repairs today." There was a brief silence. "How much?" "Approximately $50,000. Another pause. Then she laughed. "Convenient." I clenched my jaw. "This isn't an estimate for cosmetic work. This is emergency stabilization." "Or," she replied coolly, "it's an opportunity for your company to pad another invoice." I took a slow breath. "Linda, if we wait, you're risking every lakefront property." "Then email the proposal." "I don't have time for committee approval." "That's your problem." Before I could respond, she hung up. Mike looked at me. "What now?" I looked back at the crack, then at the dark clouds gathering over the mountains. I already knew what my father would have done. "Call the crew," I said. We're starting the repairs." Mike hesitated. Without written authorization? I nodded. If that dam fails because I waited for paperwork, I'll never forgive myself. I had no idea that saving their homes without permission would become the very excuse the HOA would use to refuse paying the bill and turn this into the biggest legal fight of my life. For 3 straight days, my crew worked from sunrise until well after dark. We stabilized the retaining wall with reinforced concrete, installed steel anchors, sealed the fractured section, and reinforced the drainage channels before the next storm rolled through. By the time the rain finally hit, the dam held exactly as our engineers had predicted. The lake never rose beyond safe levels. Not a single lake house suffered damage. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I was staring at a 1-page letter from the Cedar Ridge Shores HOA. Invoice denied. No explanation beyond a single sentence. The board did not authorize the work performed and therefore accepts no financial responsibility for the claimed expenses. I read it 3 times, hoping I'd somehow missed another page. Emily leaned against my office door. That's it? That's it, she folded her arms. They begged you to inspect that wall every year. I know. They knew it was failing. I know. And now they won't pay? I slid the letter across my desk. They're betting I'll walk away. Instead, I called the only person I trusted to tell me the truth, even if I didn't like it. David Mercer had been my father's attorney before becoming mine. At 65, he had the calm demeanor of someone who had spent 4 decades untangling complicated property disputes. He rarely raised his voice, rarely showed emotion, and never made promises he couldn't keep. An hour later, he sat across from me, reading every page of the contract files my father had kept since the original development was built. He adjusted his glasses and looked up. Ryan, did you ever actually read Exhibit C? I've read the contract. No, he said, tapping a yellow document clipped to the back. You read the main agreement. Exhibit C is where the real story begins. He handed me the file. Attached was an amendment dated 32 years earlier, signed by the original developer, the county, and my father. I frowned. I don't remember seeing this, because no one ever needed it. David pointed to a paragraph buried near the bottom. In the event of non-payment for emergency maintenance performed to preserve public safety or community infrastructure, Carter Infrastructure Services shall retain the right to suspend non-emergency access services under its ownership until all outstanding obligations have been satisfied. I looked at him. Non-emergency access services? He smiled for the first time that afternoon. The private roads to the vacation lake houses. I blinked. The electronic gates. Yes. The bridge access control system. Also yes. I leaned back slowly as the pieces began falling into place. David wasn't finished. I visited the county recorder's office before coming here. He pulled another folder from his briefcase. Inside were property maps, recorded easements, and ownership filings. Every critical access system surrounding the exclusive Lake House Peninsula, the gates, bridge controls, security network, and maintenance easements, was still legally owned by my company. The HOA had been managing the neighborhood for years, but they'd never actually owned the infrastructure that controlled access to its most valuable properties. David closed the folder. They thought they were refusing to pay a bill. He looked me squarely in the eyes. They never realized they were breaching the one contract that gave you every legal advantage. I didn't act immediately. That was the first thing David insisted on. They're expecting an emotional response, he said, as we sat in his office the next morning. If you lock those gates today, they'll paint you as a vindictive contractor. We do this by the book. So what's the first move? We make it impossible for anyone to say they weren't warned. Within 24 hours, David drafted a formal notice of default. It outlined every invoice, every engineering report, every emergency repair log, and every email I'd sent asking for authorization before beginning the work. Attached to it was a timeline showing that Linda had been informed of the danger, acknowledged the repair estimate, and chose not to approve it. At the end of the notice was a simple demand. The HOA had 10 business days to pay the outstanding $50,000 balance or enter into a written payment agreement. If they failed to do so, Carter Infrastructure Services would exercise its contractual right to suspend all non-emergency access services under Exhibit C. David sent copies by certified mail, email, and overnight courier. "There," he said, placing the receipts in a folder. "No surprises, no shortcuts." For 6 days, there was nothing. No phone calls, no emails, no payment. Then on the 7th day, Linda arrived at my office unannounced. She didn't knock. She pushed through the front door with 2 board members behind her and marched straight toward my desk. Emily stepped in front of her. "Mrs. Holloway, you need an appointment." Linda ignored her. She slapped the notice of default onto my desk. "This is extortion." I stood slowly. "No, it's a contract." "You expect us to believe you're going to shut down access to private homes over one invoice? I expect you to read the agreement your own association renewed 3 years ago." Her face tightened. "We've spoken to homeowners." "So have I. They'll sue you." "They're welcome to." One of the board members, a man named Greg Collins, leaned forward. "You'll destroy your company's reputation." I looked directly at him. "My company just prevented millions of dollars in flood damage. Your board refused to pay the people who saved your neighborhood." For the first time, Greg looked uncertain. Linda noticed. She turned sharply toward him. "Don't." Then she looked back at me. "If you embarrass this association, I promise you'll never work in this county again." The room went silent. Emily's eyes widened. Even David, who had quietly walked into the office a few moments earlier, paused before speaking. "Mrs. Holloway," he said calmly. "Thank you." She frowned. "For what?" "For making that threat in front of 4 witnesses." Her confidence flickered. David handed her a business card. "From this moment forward, all communication goes through my office." She snatched the card without another word and stormed out. The next morning, the payment deadline expired. Not $1 had been paid. At exactly 8 a.m., I signed the authorization order. My operations manager entered a security code into the access control system. One by one, every electronic gate leading to the private Lake House Peninsula switched to restricted access. Less than 30 minutes later, my phone began ringing non-stop. By noon, the HOA had filed for an emergency court injunction, and the judge scheduled a hearing for the very next morning. By 8:30 the next morning, the courthouse in Coeur d'Alene was already buzzing. Word had spread far beyond Cedar Ridge shores. Homeowners filled nearly every bench in the gallery. A few local reporters sat quietly near the back with notepads open. Several of my employees had come on their own time, while members of the HOA board gathered together at the plaintiff's table, whispering anxiously. Linda Holloway never looked in my direction. David adjusted his tie and leaned toward me. "Remember," he said quietly, "don't react. Let the documents do the talking." When the bailiff called the courtroom to order, everyone stood as Judge Eleanor Whitman entered. She wasted no time. "I understand the plaintiffs are requesting an emergency injunction restoring access to the Lake House Peninsula." The HOA's attorney, Richard Sloan, stood first. "Your Honor, my clients are being unlawfully denied access to their homes. This action has created unnecessary hardship for dozens of residents and constitutes an abuse of contractual authority." Judge Whitman nodded. "And the defendant?" David rose calmly. "Your Honor, the plaintiffs omitted one important fact." He placed a thick binder on the evidence table. "They breached a legally binding agreement after refusing payment for emergency infrastructure repairs that preserved those very properties." The judge looked toward Linda. "Is there an unpaid invoice?" Linda finally spoke. "The work was unauthorized." David didn't interrupt. Instead, he handed the clerk a series of exhibits: engineering inspection reports, photographs of the cracked retaining wall, weather forecast issued before the repairs, email correspondence, phone records, and finally, the certified letter proving the HOA had received our notice of default 11 days earlier. Judge Whitman flipped carefully through each document. Then she looked directly at Linda. "Mrs. Holloway, did you receive this notice?" Linda hesitated. "Yes." "And did your board respond?" "No." "Did you dispute the engineering findings with another licensed engineer?" "No." "Did you obtain an independent inspection before refusing payment?" Linda swallowed. "No." The courtroom grew noticeably quieter. Richard Sloan attempted to redirect the discussion. Regardless of payment, Your Honor, restricting access to occupied residences is unreasonable. David smiled slightly. We agree. The judge raised an eyebrow. David continued, which is precisely why Carter Infrastructure Services never blocked emergency services, public safety vehicles, utility workers, or permanent residents. He clicked a remote. A map appeared on the courtroom monitor. Colored routes highlighted every accessible emergency entrance. Then another document appeared. The access logs. David spoke clearly. Every homeowner whose primary residence was inside the restricted area retained unrestricted access. The only suspended privileges affected recreational lake houses reached through privately owned infrastructure governed by Exhibit C. A murmur swept across the courtroom. Several homeowners turned toward the HOA board with expressions of disbelief. Judge Whitman adjusted her glasses. So the association's emergency petition describes families being trapped. She looked at the access records. Yet these records indicate every permanent resident entered and exited normally. David nodded. Correct, Your Honor. The judge's gaze shifted back to Linda. Mrs. Holloway. Her voice became noticeably firmer. Did your petition fail to disclose that distinction? Linda opened her mouth. No words came out. For the first time since this ordeal began, the confidence that had carried her through every meeting, every threat, and every accusation completely disappeared. Judge Whitman slowly closed the file in front of her. I've heard enough. She reached for her notes. The entire courtroom held its breath as she prepared to announce her ruling.
You could have heard a pin drop. Judge Whitman looked across the silent courtroom, resting her hands on the bench before speaking. After reviewing the evidence presented, this court finds that Carter Infrastructure Services acted within the authority granted by the governing agreements executed between the original developer, the county, and the defendant. She paused just long enough for the words to sink in. The plaintiffs were provided with multiple notices regarding the deteriorating condition of the retaining wall. They were informed of the estimated repair costs, declined to authorize the work, and later refused payment after the emergency repairs successfully prevented substantial property damage. Linda's shoulders slumped. The judge continued. Furthermore, the court finds no evidence that permanent residents were denied emergency or residential access. The emergency petition filed by the Homeowners Association materially omitted that fact. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Judge Whitman wasn't finished. The request for an emergency injunction is therefore denied. Linda's attorney closed his eyes for a moment. Then came the part none of us expected. Based upon the evidence presented today, Judge Whitman said, this court orders the Cedar Ridge Shores Homeowners Association to remit the outstanding $50,000 repair invoice within 10 calendar days. She turned another page. In addition, because the defendant was forced to retain legal counsel to enforce an otherwise valid contractual obligation, the plaintiffs shall reimburse reasonable attorney's fees and court costs, with the final amount to be determined upon submission. David leaned over and whispered, That's even better than I expected. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Months of frustration, sleepless nights, and second-guessing myself seemed to leave my body all at once. Across the courtroom, Linda looked stunned. One of the other board members, Harold Simmons, slowly stood. Your Honor, he said quietly. May I say something? The judge nodded. Harold turned, not toward the bench, but toward me. His voice was heavy with regret. Ryan, on behalf of the homeowners who weren't told the whole story, I'm sorry. The room fell silent again. Another board member looked at Linda. You told us there wasn't any contract. A third added, You said he was bluffing. Linda didn't answer. She simply stared at the table. Outside the courthouse, reporters were waiting. Microphones were pushed toward me as soon as I stepped onto the courthouse steps. Mr. Carter, did you ever intend to punish the homeowners? No, I answered honestly. I intended to enforce the same contract my company honored for more than 30 years. If we'd ignored that dam, those families could have lost millions in property damage. We did the right thing. Within days, the HOA issued payment in full, including every dollar of my legal fees. At the association's next meeting, homeowners voted to remove Linda Holloway as president and recalled 2 board members who had supported her decisions. A month later, the new board publicly apologized,
renewed our long-term maintenance agreement, and asked my company to conduct a complete inspection of every piece of infrastructure around the lake.
The irony wasn't lost on me. The very contractor they had tried to discredit had become the one they trusted to protect their community once again. It's been almost a year since everything happened, and Cedar Ridge Shores feels like a completely different neighborhood. These days, when I drive through the entrance, the security gate opens without drama, the lake is calm, and homeowners wave instead of looking away. My crew still inspects the dam every spring and fall, just as my father taught me. Because good infrastructure isn't about winning arguments, it's about protecting people before they ever realize they're in danger. The experience taught me something I'll never forget. Contracts matter. Integrity matters even more. Doing the right thing isn't always rewarded immediately. Sometimes you'll be criticized, blamed, or even taken to court for making the responsible choice. But if you keep thorough records, tell the truth, and stand by your principles, the facts have a way of speaking louder than accusations. I still keep my father's old hard hat on the shelf in my office. Whenever I look at it, I'm reminded of his favorite saying, "Build it right, stand by your work, and never let someone else's pride convince you to abandon what's right." After everything that happened, I finally understand exactly what he meant. Thank you so much for staying with me through this story. If you've ever dealt with an HOA, a difficult neighbor, or someone who thought they were above the rules, I'd love to hear your experience. What's the most unbelievable HOA or property dispute you've ever witnessed? If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future stories of justice, property rights, and real-life neighborhood drama. Until next time, take care of your home, stand up for what's right, and thanks for watching.